Uh, let's talk about central banking and the Federal Reserve. So the central bank is the government-owned or sponsored bank that lives in a country. So there's the Bank of England, there's the Bank of Japan, there's the People's Bank of China, there's the Bank of Korea, there's the Bundesbank in Germany, there's the Riksbank, and you can probably figure out where that is. There's the European Central Bank. There's lots and lots and lots of these banks all over the planet Earth. In the United States, we have the Federal Reserve System. Okay? These central banks have specific functions. What are these functions? Well, number one, the Federal Reserve is the largest clearinghouse for checks and electronic transactions in the world. So when you go use your debit card and you're with Wells Fargo and the business that you just paid is with Bank of America, the Federal Reserve is probably in the middle of that transaction. So when the money has to get from your Wells Fargo account over to an account in Bank of America, that between bank part of that transaction is probably facilitated by the Federal Reserve, right? In the old days when we wrote checks, you used to actually get your check back. If you've ever written a check, go to your bank account and look at the check online, and you'll see it has stuff on the back of the check that tells you what happened to that check. And that check likely went through the Federal Reserve. Okay? Number two, there's rules and regulations for how banks can operate, like the stuff that's in your book about 10%, like the new stuff that's replaced that 10%. The rules and regulations that banks have to follow are approved by the Federal Reserve. You should note, for example, that there are anti-discrimination laws in lending, that banks can't use race and gender to do decision making in making loans, and those rules come from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has, for a really long time, had rules to try to prevent discrimination in lending. What you do at your bank, banks do at the Fed. So a bank can walk into the Federal Reserve and get a loan. I don't know how a bank walks in, but you know what I mean. Bank can get a loan. The bank has an account at the Federal Reserve, like a checking account. Bank has the ability to go get a loan from the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve doesn't give it a toaster or some present for opening an account, but banks bank at the Federal Reserve. The central bank controls the money supply and interest rates, so one of the Fed's jobs is to decide what the money supply is and decide what interest rates are. And then the Fed is something called the lender of last resort. When times are bad, who's supposed to make sure that the system works and that there's money in the system? Yeah, that's the Federal Reserve, and we call that lender of last resort. So the Fed, the coronavirus thing hits, the Fed makes loans to banks. If banks get in trouble, it thinks about making loans to businesses, direct loans, to try to help them out. It wants to make sure that the financial system works, okay, during a crisis, and that's called lender of last resort. So when the United States is founded, we actually get something called the Bank of the United States, set up by Alexander Hamilton. If you know your American history, maybe the most important Supreme Court case of all time is over the Bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson didn't think the Bank of the United States was legal. Lots of people didn't think it was legal. When the Bank of the United States opened a branch in Maryland, Maryland tries to tax it, and it ends up at the Supreme Court. We get a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. That's the case where the Supreme Court declares that it can overrule laws. It can declare laws unconstitutional, which it's not going to do here. It's going to decide, in fact, that having a bank, a central bank, is constitutional. Andrew Jackson's going to disagree, and he's going to shut the Bank of the United States down. But the Supreme Court says it is constitutional, and it answers questions about the powers of the United States and about the states. So, for example, the states cannot tax the federal government. Okay? So Nevada cannot charge property taxes on Nellis Air Force Base. States cannot charge taxes onto the federal government. All right? Bank of the United States. Is that exciting? Okay. So you can read all about that if you feel like it. The Bank of the United States is killed in 1836 by Andrew Jackson, and the United States does not have a central bank going forward from 1836. There are a number of financial crises that happen in the United States during the years after 1836, and the federal government has trouble dealing with them. So there's a panic of 1907, and who saves the country in 1907 is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan sits in his office in New York. Banks come visit him they're in financial trouble, and he decides to bail out banks or not bail them out. So what banks survived this panic in 1907 is decided by J.P. Morgan and a few of his friends. Well, Congress is like, yeah, that sucks. We should do something about that. So they empower a commission. That commission decides to create the Federal Reserve System, and it's created in 1913. It's called, you notice that it's not called the Bank of the United States, it's not called central bank, it's Reserve System. It's got a unique name compared to all the other central banks. And the reason is that not the politicians ever lie, but they lied to the country. Because Andrew Jackson was so adamant that central banks were unconstitutional, they didn't believe, the people who were creating this did not believe that people would approve of it if they thought it was a central bank. So they lied, and they said it's a system to balance reserves. So farm communities need money certain times of the year, but other times of the year nobody's asking for a loan, right? They need loans during planting time. Everybody pays their loans off during harvest time. So if you go to a farm community, some parts of the year they're really short of reserves, and some parts of the year they've got a whole bunch of money just sitting there doing nothing. So the idea of the Federal Reserve is that areas of the country can share reserves, that the federal government could make reserves move around, make life better for the farmers, make life better for businesses. Wherever there was not enough reserves, the federal government could move reserves to from where there were too many reserves, they weren't making any money. And you with me? And that's how this system was sold to the American public. It was a big old fat lie about what they were really going to do. It's intended that the Fed be independent. When it was first created, it was not. And during the Great Depression, they really made it independent. And we'll talk about that in a later chapter. The chair of the Federal Reserve is a guy named Jerome Powell. And that's his picture. Hi, wave, Jerome Powell. Okay? There's a Federal Reserve is run by a board of governors. They're appointed by the president, ratified by the Senate. There's supposed to be 7 of them. However, the last 2 years that Obama was president, the Republicans controlled the Senate, and they refused to approve any appointees that came out of the Obama White House. They just refused for 2 years. They wouldn't approve anybody. So when Donald Trump becomes president, there are only 2 members of the Board of Governors, Jerome Powell and a woman named Lael Brainerd. And that's it. There's only 2 of them. Only 2 of them. And there's problems with that because, for example, there are things in the Federal Reserve Act that basically say, if 4 people agree, then the Fed can do this. And it doesn't say if a majority agrees. It literally says if 4 people agree. Well, there was only 2 of them. Okay? And in May of 2020, there were still only 5 of them. So more than 3.5 years after Donald Trump became president, he'd only increased the number of governors from 2 to 5. And there's still not 7 people on the Federal Reserve Board. Okay? In theory, these people have 14-year terms. Hardly anybody ever does that anymore. They stay for a few years and they go do something else. But in theory, they get to serve for 14 years, which means in 2020, 14 years ago was 2006. That means that there should still be 1 person on the Federal Reserve Board that was appointed by President Bush. So in 2020, there should be 1 Bush appointee. There should be 3 3-ish Obamas, depends on the date, I haven't really looked, but 3 or 4 Obamas and 2 or 3 Trumps. In fact, there's 2 Obamas and 3 Trumps. And quite possibly by the time, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, it would be highly likely that by the end of his time he would have appointed all of them, even though that's never supposed to happen. Anyway, we'll come talk about that. The chair only serves as chair for 4 years. You have to pick one of the people that are on the board, and they're the chair for 4 years. So when Donald Trump comes in, a woman named Janet Yellen, who was the first female chair of the Federal Reserve, she's the chair. Her time comes up. Donald Trump removes her and picks Jay Powell, who is, again, already on the Federal Reserve. You have to be on the Federal Reserve, and makes him the chair. There's a whole stuff about that that's very rare. That's only the second time since World War II that a president has not reappointed the chair that was already sitting there. And the first time it happened, the economy was in really bad shape, and that chair was obviously over his head. Janet Yellen and Jay Powell largely agree on what the Fed was doing and where it was going, and nobody quite gets why Janet Yellen wasn't reappointed as the chair of the Federal Reserve. She and Jay Powell basically agreed on everything. So it was an interesting time, something we hadn't seen before. The Federal Reserve is split into 12 districts, so there are actually 12 Federal Reserve banks, and they're scattered across the country. In fact, there's more than that because there's branches, but 12 district banks that are scattered across the country. We'll look at a map of this in a second. Out here in Nevada, we're in the San Francisco district. That woman right there, Mary Daly, she is the president of the San Francisco Fed. Okay? Every Fed district is run by a board of directors, which is 9 people. 3 of those 9 people are elected by the banks. 3 of them are business people, and 3 of them are what we call the non-banking public. So, for example, in May of 2020, the non-banking people include the head of the Screen Actors Guild. The person who's in charge of the Screen Actors Guild, the union for actors, that person is one of the 9 directors of the San Francisco Fed. The CEO of Panda Express for a long time was one of the business people that was on the board of directors of the Fed. Okay? You know where Las Vegas is in the 12th district in the San Francisco district. If you have a check and your check is processed from a local bank, and not all banks in Nevada use it, but if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of one of my checks, there's a set of numbers that run across the bottom of the check. The first 2 of those numbers are 12. That means that check comes from a bank in the 12th Federal Reserve District. And in our case, we go through the LA branch, not through San Francisco, so there's more numbers on there that if you know what you're doing, you know you're from the LA branch and blah, blah, blah. Okay? Very exciting? All right. So this is a map of the Federal Reserve districts. Now, there was debate about how many there should be. So the original law said anywhere between 4 and 12. They thought that they'd have trouble getting even 4 cities to want to be Fed. As it turned out, they could have made dozens of Federal Reserve districts because everybody in America wanted a Federal Reserve district bank in their city. So they'd use the maximum possible number of districts, which is 12. Each district is supposed to represent kind of a unique economic interest. So if you go back, all of the steel mills in America and all the auto plants in America were in 4. So when this is done, 4 is steel, automobiles, right? 2 is New York, the whole financial thing. New England's a district. I grew up in 10. 10 is farmers and ranchers, mining, right? That's what happens in 10. 11 is farmers and ranchers, but it's oil. That's what they say down there, oil. It means oil, to those of you who didn't get that part. Okay? Each unit is, except for 12. We're out here in the Katniss-Everdeen district. Our district has no commonality. We have Alaska and Hawaii. We have Idaho. We have Silicon Valley, right, and Microsoft. And we have farmers and ranchers and potato people and gaming and Hollywood. we have the most interesting, diverse district. But in 1913, it wasn't quite so interesting and diverse, right? So we might forgive them, but probably they just drew the other districts and went, oh, all right, so all the rest of you are in 12, right? No? Okay. Anyway, that's the deal. And there is no hidden District 13 with a